"Start my Lamborghini on the first try and it's yours," shouted Patrick Whitmore, the Billionaire host, raising his glass with mocking delight toward the cleaning lady. Laughter thundered beneath the crystal chandeliers as the entire showroom erupted. Glasses lifted high, phones recording. The wealthy guests reveled in the humiliation as though it were just another form of entertainment. At the center of that cruel circle stood Emily Ramos, in her blue uniform and rubber gloves, gripping her mop handle as if it were her last piece of dignity. She lowered her gaze, swallowing hard, while Patrick pressed on with arrogance. "One chance. If you manage it, the car is yours." The laughter swelled louder, sharper, merciless. Yet no one in that room suspected that this young woman, dismissed as invisible, was about to ignite something far more powerful than an engine, a truth strong enough to shatter the pride of the most arrogant man in the hall. Before we begin this emotional story, tell us in the comments from which city you are watching us, and leave your like to keep following our stories. Crystal chandeliers spilled rivers of golden light across the polished showroom floor, reflecting off rows of Lamborghinis and Ferraris like a hall of mirrors. Champagne glasses clinked, designer perfumes mingled with the faint smell of leather seats, and laughter rippled through the crowd of Los Angeles' most glamorous elite. At the center of it all stood Patrick Whitmore, tuxedo sharp, a billionaire CEO basking in attention as though the entire evening was staged for him alone. His laugh cut through the air, loud, mocking, cruel. "Ladies and gentlemen," he shouted, lifting his glass high, "let's have a little fun tonight. Look at her. She scrubs the floors, yet dares to stand in the middle of my showroom." His finger stabbed toward Emily Ramos, the young cleaning lady in a plain blue uniform, rubber gloves still wet from the mop she clutched like a shield. The crowd turned, eyes narrowing, smirks spreading. Emily lowered her gaze, her lips pressed tight but her knuckles whitened on the mop handle. She had been invisible all night, gliding between spilled drops of champagne and polished tires. Now she was a spectacle. Patrick stepped closer, circling her as though she were prey. "Tell you what," he sneered, voice dripping arrogance, "see that Lamborghini Aventador behind me? If you can start it on the first try, if you can even figure out how to turn the key, it's yours." His words echoed, bouncing off marble floors and glass walls. Gasps, then laughter. A wave of phones rose into the air as guests scrambled to record. "Start his Lamborghini," someone jeered. Another voice, "She probably doesn't even know which pedal is the brake." Laughter again, cruel and contagious. Emily's chest tightened, her heart hammering so loudly she feared the microphones of those phones could catch it. Her instinct was to back away, to vanish into the shadows where she belonged. But she didn't move. She looked at the car, sleek, white, predatory, and then at Patrick, his grin wide, daring her to crumble. Her throat was dry, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Fine," she said quietly, though the silence in the room carried it further than she intended. "I'll do it." The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, more laughter. Patrick threw back his head and roared with delight. "Oh, this will be priceless," he said. He gestured grandly to the Lamborghini, the spotlight catching on his cufflinks. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's watch our maid try to tame a beast worth $500,000. Emily took a single step forward. The mop clattered softly against the floor as she set it aside, her gloved hands trembling not from fear, but from the weight of 1,000 eyes. The path to the Lamborghini seemed longer than a lifetime, each step a battle against the tide of humiliation, pressing in from every corner of the showroom. And as she reached for the car door, a hush fell. Patrick leaned back against the bar, sipping champagne, smirking with the certainty of a man who believed the world existed solely to applaud him. The crowd surged forward, forming a half circle around the Lamborghini like spectators at a coliseum. Heels clicked against marble, tuxedo jackets brushed shoulders, and the glint of sequined gowns caught the light as everyone angled for the perfect view. The Aventador sat there like a sleeping beast, its white body gleaming beneath chandeliers, the symbol of untouchable wealth. Emily stood beside the driver's door, rubber gloves still on her hands. She hesitated only a second before pulling the handle. The door lifted upward in a smooth, theatrical motion, and a murmur rippled through the crowd. Some amused, some surprised she even knew how to open it. Patrick chuckled darkly, shaking his head, as though this were the opening act of a comedy routine written just for him. Sliding into the leather seat, Emily felt swallowed by the cockpit. The sharp scent of new leather filled her lungs, and her fingertips brushed the futuristic dashboard. She remembered engines older than she was, grease under her nails, her father's patient voice explaining pistons and ignition coils. The contrast was dizzying. "Don't stall too long," Patrick called out, his tone playful but edged with cruelty. "We wouldn't want you to faint from the smell of real money." The crowd laughed on cue, some raising their phones higher, red recording dots glowing like a constellation. Emily placed her gloved hands on the steering wheel. For a moment, she simply sat there, eyes closed, as though listening to something no one else could hear. Then she reached forward, fingers steady, and pressed the start button. The Lamborghini coughed once, sputtered, then fell silent. An explosion of laughter erupted around her. Someone clapped mockingly, another whistled. "She killed it!" A man in a velvet blazer shouted. "Didn't even last a second!" Champagne sloshed from crystal flutes as guests jostled one another in delight. Patrick grinned like a king enjoying the downfall of a jester. He pointed directly at Emily, his voice booming over the chaos. "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the cleaning lady who thought she could be a driver." Inside the car, Emily's pulse raced, but her face remained unreadable. She didn't defend herself, didn't look away. Instead, she placed her hand back on the wheel, her jaw tightening ever so slightly. The ridicule poured down on her, but she sat still, calm in the storm, as though she knew something no one else in that room could even imagine. Patrick raised his glass, eyes gleaming with the thrill of the crowd's laughter. He began a loud countdown, savoring every number like a master of ceremonies dragging out a finale. 3, 2, 1. Dozens of phones zoomed in on Emily's face, ready to capture her second humiliation. A woman in a red gown leaned into her friend's ear and whispered, "She's going to cry, watch." The friend smirked, already typing captions for her social feed. Emily didn't move. She let Patrick's countdown die in the air, her hands resting loosely on the wheel. The silence that followed felt almost unbearable, broken only by a few nervous giggles. Then, at last, she leaned forward and touched the ignition again. The car made another faint sound, not quite catching, then stilled. The laughter roared louder this time, rolling across the showroom in waves. People clapped like an audience at a cruel play. Patrick nearly doubled over, his voice dripping arrogance. Twice, she failed twice. You'd think she was trying to start a lawnmower. Still seated, Emily turned her head just slightly toward him, her voice quiet but cutting through the noise. "That wasn't my attempt." The words landed like a stone dropped into a pond. A hush rippled outward. Some of the guests blinked, confused. A man near the front frowned, lowering his phone. "What does she mean?" he muttered. Patrick straightened, the smile twitching on his lips. "Oh? Not your attempt? What do you call that then? A warm-up?" Emily's eyes, calm and steady, locked on his. She didn't answer. She simply turned back to the wheel, her silence more defiant than any speech. Murmurs spread. A few guests began to exchange uncertain glances. The certainty of her failure wasn't quite so solid anymore. Something about her composure, the way she didn't flinch, the way her hands moved with precision instead of fumbling, gnawed at their amusement. Patrick, feeling the shift, raised his voice, desperate to reassert control. "Fine," he barked. "One final attempt, one chance left. If you fail again, you mop up this whole place while we drink to your performance." His grin returned, but his eyes betrayed the first flicker of unease. Emily adjusted her seat, slow and deliberate, every movement watched by 100 curious eyes. For the first time, the crowd leaned forward, not to laugh, but to see what she would do next. The hum of voices quieted, as if the entire room inhaled at once. All eyes fixed on Emily, framed by the open scissor door of the Lamborghini. The showroom lights gleamed across the smooth curve of the car's hood, throwing pale reflections onto her uniform, her gloves, the resolute line of her jaw. Patrick's command, one final attempt, hung in the air like a sentence passed down from a cruel judge. Emily didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned back in the leather seat, exhaling slowly, the way her father once taught her to steady her hands before touching an engine. Her fingers traced over the dashboard, not searching blindly, but moving with the assurance of someone who recognized the silent logic behind every button and switch. The crowd shifted uneasily. Their laughter had thinned, replaced by murmurs and the occasional nervous cough. A young man in the front row whispered, "She's not fumbling. She knows what she's doing." His date hushed him quickly, but she too couldn't look away from Emily's calm demeanor. Patrick forced a chuckle, raising his glass again. "Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy this moment. A cleaning lady pretending she belongs in my world. It's the greatest comedy you'll ever see." But his words, instead of fueling laughter, seemed to ring hollow. Several guests didn't laugh this time. Their expressions carried something else: curiosity, even doubt. Emily adjusted her gloves, placed both hands firmly on the wheel, and leaned closer. She closed her eyes for a beat, letting the memory of her father's garage rise within her. The oil-stained floor, the metallic clang of wrenches, the warmth of a man's voice telling her that machines only needed respect to reveal their secrets. Her lashes lifted, steady and certain, and she pressed the ignition. A cough, a sputter, then silence again. Gasps shot through the crowd, followed quickly by uneasy laughter. A man near the back clapped sarcastically, but it was weaker than before. Emily sat still, her face unreadable. If she was disappointed, she didn't show it. Instead, she released the wheel and leaned back, folding her hands in her lap as though the failed start had been part of her plan. Patrick seized the moment, striding forward, arms stretched wide. "See? It's done. She's finished. 3 strikes and you're out. Now, back to where you belong, with a mop in your hands." His voice boomed across the showroom, and though some guests laughed on cue, others exchanged wary looks. Emily finally spoke, her voice soft but steady, carrying more weight than his shouting. "That wasn't failure," she said simply. The silence was heavier this time, pressing against the walls. A ripple of uncertainty moved through the crowd, as if invisible threads of tension were tightening around them. Phones were still raised, but now they weren't just recording for mockery. They were waiting to see if this young woman in rubber gloves would somehow defy everything they thought they knew. Patrick's grin faltered for just a second, then returned, sharper, forced. "Then prove it," he snapped. "Prove it in front of all of us." Emily placed her hands back on the wheel. This time, her eyes didn't leave his. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Guests leaned forward, champagne glasses forgotten, eyes glued to the young cleaning lady sitting in a $500,000 Lamborghini. Emily's gloved fingers tightened on the wheel, her spine straightening with a quiet authority no one expected. For the first time that night, Patrick Whitmore looked less like a triumphant host and more like a man whose stage was slipping out from under him. Emily inhaled deeply, a calm that seemed almost unnatural against the weight of so many eyes. She reached for the ignition again, her movements precise, not rushed. The silence was deafening. Even the hum of the chandeliers above felt distant. Then, with a sharp growl, the Aventador's engine roared to life. The beast awoke in an instant, coughing once before unleashing a thunderous symphony of pistons and fire. The ground itself seemed to vibrate, the marble floor trembling beneath the shoes of stunned onlookers. Gasps filled the room, followed by a wave of disbelieving shouts. Phones shook as guests tried to capture every second of the impossible sight. Emily's face remained calm, almost serene, her hands steady on the wheel. She gave the accelerator a gentle tap, and the car responded with a guttural purr that echoed through the showroom like a victory song. "No way," someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the roar. Another guest clutched his friend's arm, eyes wide. She did it. She actually did it. The earlier laughter had evaporated, replaced by something heavier, awe. Patrick froze. The glass in his hand tilted, spilling champagne onto his polished shoes, but he didn't even notice. His smile cracked, then faltered completely as the reality sank in. Around him, the very crowd that had laughed at Emily began to shift. Applause started, hesitant at first, then stronger, echoing until it drowned out even the Aventador's growl. "Unbelievable!" shouted a man in the back. "She started it like a pro." Patrick raised his hand, his voice strained, desperate to wrestle back control. "It's luck, a stupid accident." He forced a laugh, but it rang hollow in the sea of applause and cheers. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. But no one laughed with him this time. Instead, all eyes remained fixed on Emily. She pressed the accelerator again, and the Lamborghini answered with a defiant roar, as if mocking its own owner. The sound rolled through the glass walls of the showroom, spilling into the Los Angeles night. Emily turned her head, meeting Patrick's eyes across the crowd. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The look in her eyes said everything. This isn't luck. This is knowledge. This is dignity. Patrick's throat tightened. He felt the shift, the betrayal of his audience turning against him, the empire of arrogance he had built crumbling before his very eyes. The thunder of the Lamborghini's engine still rattled the showroom windows when Patrick stumbled forward, his voice cracking under the pressure. "Enough!" he barked, his usual commanding tone frayed with panic. He slammed his empty glass onto a table, the stem shattering against the marble. Shards scattered, ignored by the crowd now pressing closer to the car, their phones raised high like torches at a vigil. "She cheated!" Patrick shouted, his face flushed crimson. "Someone tampered with the engine. There's no way she could do this. She's a cleaning lady." His words, sharp and bitter, fell flat against the cheers still rolling across the room. Emily remained seated, her gloved hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. The Aventador purred steadily, its low rumble mocking Patrick's accusations. She didn't bother defending herself. The sound of the engine was defense enough. The longer it growled, the more foolish his words became. "Keep your promise," a voice rang out from the back of the crowd. Others quickly joined in, their chants overlapping. "You said it was hers!" someone yelled. "Honor your word!" another shouted. Guests who once laughed with Patrick now turned against him, their jeers cutting through the tension like knives. Patrick's chest tightened. For the first time in years, he wasn't in control of the room. The spotlight that always belonged to him now framed the woman he had tried to humiliate. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting around for escape, for a way to twist the narrative back into his favor. "Fine," he snapped, his voice cracking like a whip. He raised both arms, demanding silence, and the noise subsided just enough for his words to carry. "If she really thinks she deserves my car, then let's see her prove it." His eyes narrowed on Emily, his smile returning, sharp as broken glass. "Start it is one thing. Drive it is another. If she can drive it across the showroom floor without stalling, then, and only then, will I honor my word." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "That's dangerous," while another whispered, "He's desperate." The unease didn't matter to Patrick. He thrived on raising the stakes, on turning humiliation into a game played by his rules. Emily finally lifted her hands from the wheel, her gaze calm and steady as she looked at him through the windshield. The crowd hushed, waiting for her refusal, for her to retreat into the shadows he had tried to pin her to. Instead, she reached down, tapped the accelerator once more, and the Aventador answered with a thunderous growl that vibrated through the bones of everyone watching. The cheer that followed wasn't mocking this time. It was support, genuine, fierce, undeniable. Strangers who had mocked her minutes earlier now clapped and shouted her name, swept into the unexpected power of her defiance. Patrick's smirk wavered again. For the first time that evening, he realized the unthinkable. The room no longer belonged to him. The Lamborghini trembled under Emily's touch, its growl rolling like thunder through the cavernous showroom. A wall of faces pressed closer, some standing on tiptoe, others climbing onto chairs, all desperate to witness what would happen next. The cameras on their phones burned with red dots, millions of invisible eyes waiting beyond the glass screens. Emily slid her hand to the gear shift, her movements fluid, deliberate. The leather squeaked softly beneath her uniform as she adjusted herself in the seat. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She simply breathed, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm, her gloved fingers caressing the controls like old friends. The crowd held its breath. With a smooth motion, Emily eased the car forward. The Lamborghini obeyed instantly, gliding off its pedestal like a panther unchained. The tires rolled silently at first, then purred as they gripped the polished floor. Gasps and shouts burst from the crowd. A woman clutched her pearls. A man dropped his champagne flute, glass exploding at his feet. Emily's face remained impassive, her eyes fixed ahead. She turned the wheel slightly, guiding the beast between two towering displays of polished chrome. The Aventador moved with a grace that made every heart in the room pound. With each controlled press of the accelerator, the car surged and then settled, like an animal acknowledging its rider. "Impossible," someone whispered. Another voice, stronger this time. "She drives like she's done this her whole life." Murmurs spread like wildfire. What was supposed to be a humiliation had become a showcase, a silent rebellion that stripped Patrick's arrogance bare. Patrick himself stood rigid, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles whitened. The smirk had vanished from his face entirely, replaced by something raw, fear. He could feel the tide turning, the loyalty of the crowd slipping from his grip. The billionaire CEO who had built an empire of image was watching it unravel in front of a janitor in rubber gloves. Emily brought the car to a perfect stop in the center of the floor. The Lamborghini's engine purred like a lion, settling into its throne, filling the silence that followed with a deep vibration that rattled through the bones of every guest. And then it started. First a single clap, hesitant, uncertain. Then another, louder. And then the room erupted. Applause crashed against the walls, cheers rising like waves. Strangers shouted her name, their phones flashing wildly, as if desperate to capture the moment before it slipped into legend. Emily slowly lifted her chin, her eyes finding Patrick's across the sea of faces. Her silence was deafening. She didn't need words. Her triumph was etched in every roar of the engine, every cheer that had turned against him. From the back of the crowd, a man stood still, watching. His expression was calm, but his eyes burned with recognition. Robert Ramos had seen enough. The roar of applause still echoed off the glass walls when a different kind of silence began to spread, heavy and expectant. From the very back of the crowd, where shadows pooled near the exit doors, a man stepped forward. His pace was unhurried, yet each step seemed to carve through the noise, drawing every eye without effort. Robert Ramos moved with the weight of years on his shoulders, his frame lean, his hands rough, marked by decades of work with tools and engines. His salt and pepper hair caught the light, his lined face etched with dignity that no wealth could buy. Unlike the glittering guests, his clothes were simple. Worn jeans, a plain button-down, shoes polished only by dust and time. But in that room of diamonds and silk, it was his presence that commanded attention. Emily's eyes widened. For a fleeting moment, her composure cracked, her lips parting as she recognized the figure she hadn't expected to see tonight. The crowd, confused, parted instinctively, creating a path for him as though sensing something monumental was about to unfold. Patrick's face twisted in irritation. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice brittle. "This is a private event. Security—" But Robert raised his hand, not in aggression, but with a quiet authority that silenced even the murmurs. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and carried further than Patrick's shouting ever could. "I am her father," Robert said, his eyes shifting from the billionaire to Emily, softening just slightly. "Robert Ramos." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Guests turned to one another, some whispering the name as though recalling a story half remembered. The champagne-sweet air soured into tension, as if the room itself knew secrets long buried were clawing their way to the surface. Patrick laughed, sharp and dismissive, but it trembled around the edges. "So? A janitor's father. What does that matter?" He gestured wildly toward Emily, still seated behind the wheel. "She doesn't belong here. You don't belong here." Robert's gaze hardened, unflinching. "You fired me once, Whitmore. Do you remember? Years ago when I was head mechanic in your luxury garage. My wife had just died and I had no one to care for my daughter. I brought her with me to work because she had no mother, no one else." His voice broke for a moment, then steadied again. "You threw me out. Without pay. Without dignity. Because my child dared to sit quietly in a corner while I fixed your cars." The crowd stirred, whispers turning into low outrage. A woman near the front pressed her hand to her mouth. A man muttered, "I remember Ramos. He was one of the best mechanics in the city." Patrick shook his head violently. Lies, all lies. But his eyes betrayed him, flickering with recognition he couldn't conceal. Emily gripped the wheel tighter, her chest rising and falling with the revelation she had carried in silence for so long. The showroom wasn't just a stage for her humiliation anymore. It was the place where the past had finally come to collect its debt. The air in the showroom shifted. Gone was the giddy excitement of spectacle, replaced now by something sharper, heavier. A murmur swept through the guests like a current, building into waves of outrage. Faces turned toward Patrick Whitmore, no longer with admiration but with suspicion, even disgust. "I remember him," an older man in a navy suit said aloud, his voice steady, carrying across the hush. "Robert Ramos. He was the only mechanic who could fix a carburetor no one else would touch. Whitmore fired him out of nowhere." Heads nodded in agreement. Another guest added, "And not a cent of severance." Everyone whispered about it back then. Patrick's face flushed red, then pale. He raised his hands, trying to steady his trembling voice. "These are fabrications, old stories twisted by a bitter man." His laugh was forced, brittle as glass. "Do you believe the word of a janitor over mine? A man who can barely afford shoes?" But the words backfired. Gasps erupted. A woman in a glittering silver gown hissed, "That's cruel." Someone shouted from the back, "You promised her the car. Keep your word." The chorus grew louder, voices overlapping, demanding fairness, demanding dignity. Robert stood unmoved, his posture firm, his voice calm. "You see, Whitmore, arrogance makes a man blind. You thought humiliating my daughter tonight would prove your power. But all it did was expose the truth. What you tried to destroy years ago, her spirit, you've only made stronger." Emily slowly stepped out of the Lamborghini, the crowd parting as though instinctively protecting her. She stood beside her father, their silhouettes striking against the glow of chandeliers and polished chrome. Her gloved hand brushed against his rough, oil-worn palm, the years of distance folding into that single, quiet gesture. Patrick stumbled backward, his voice desperate now. "No, this is manipulation. You all know me. I've built empires. I've donated millions. His words choked, drowned out by the wave of disapproval rolling through the room. Guests booed, shook their heads, turned their backs to him. Phones stayed up, but not for him anymore. Every lens, every camera, every angle now captured Emily and Robert standing together. What had begun as a cruel spectacle had transformed into a reckoning, and the world outside those screens was about to see it all. Robert's voice cut through the noise, quiet yet commanding. "We never needed your wealth. Tonight, everyone saw what truly lasts. Not money, not arrogance, dignity." Patrick's chest heaved, his empire of charm collapsing in front of him, and for the first time, he looked smaller than the room he once commanded. Patrick staggered backward, the spotlights that once glorified him now harsh and unforgiving, revealing every crack in his polished facade. His voice, once booming and magnetic, had shriveled into desperate fragments. This isn't how it works. I am Patrick Whitmore. You can't..." His words broke beneath the thunder of boos, the jeers of a crowd that had turned against him completely. The billionaire's empire of pride unraveled with stunning speed. The phones raised high weren't celebrating him anymore. They were documenting his downfall, capturing every tremor in his hands, every hollow denial. He reached for a glass of champagne from a nearby tray, but the waiter pulled it away sharply, as if even service staff refused to indulge his arrogance. Meanwhile, Emily stood tall beside Robert, her chin lifted, the uniform and gloves that had once marked her as invisible now glowing like armor under the chandelier's light. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. Her silence spoke louder than Patrick's shouts. She had nothing left to prove. Robert placed a hand gently on her shoulder. His eyes, damp but steady, lingered on her with the pride of a father who had carried years of grief, only to see his daughter rise where he had once been broken. "What you defended tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying over the restless crowd, "wasn't just yourself. You defended us both. You defended the truth." Guests shifted, some wiping tears, others nodding firmly. The earlier laughter, the cruelty, had turned into a collective recognition of something rare in that gilded showroom: humanity. A woman in emerald whispered to her husband, "She's stronger than all of us put together." Patrick collapsed into a chair, his hands gripping his head, his tuxedo disheveled, his empire of image collapsing around him. His Lamborghini, once his crown jewel, stood purring quietly in the center of the room, not his trophy anymore, but a testament to his humiliation. Robert's final words landed like the closing strike of a gavel. Money fades, arrogance breaks, but dignity endures. The crowd erupted, not in jeers this time, but in thunderous applause for Emily and Robert. Strangers reached out to touch her shoulder, to shake his hand, to capture the moment of redemption. Cameras flashed, voices cheered, and in the middle of it all stood a father and daughter, once invisible, now unforgettable. Patrick didn't move. His empire had been shattered not by a rival billionaire, not by scandal, but by the quiet strength of a cleaning lady and the long memory of a mechanic. And as the Lamborghini's engine finally faded into silence, the lesson hung heavy in the air. Mocking the humble can cost more than fortune. It can cost everything. In the end, Patrick's arrogance collapsed beneath the weight of truth, and Emily and Robert stood together, no longer invisible, but radiant in the light of dignity. Their story is a reminder that wealth and power may fade, but what endures is the strength of family, the quiet courage to face humiliation with grace, and the hope that justice will always find its way to the surface. Even in the darkest moments, dignity can turn pain into strength, and love can transform shame into triumph. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this touching story. Tell us in the comments what part moved you the most. Subscribe and turn on the bell to receive more stories that inspire and transform. Leave a like if you believe in the invisible strength of dignity and family. And above all, thank you for being part of this community that believes in stories with soul. And before you go, watch the story I'll leave here on the left. I'm sure it will also move you and make you reflect.